Initiation by Robert Hugh Benson. Chapter 1, Part 2. 5. It was the one period of the year at which the Campagna looks hopeful. In summer it is an oven of desolate beauty, thirsty and hot. In winter it is a corpse of magnificent dignity. In autumn it is as tragic as the deathbed of a king. But in early spring it is possible to believe that even the Campagna can hope again, and at least try on garments of rejoicing, as if her brooding memory for once was dormant, and her expectancy awake. Everywhere today, as they roared and swished over the long roads, there was a thrill in the air. It was impossible to make out details, so fast the motors went, but under the gray flats burned a faint glimmer of young green. The low hills on the horizon wore a haze of living blue. It had a curious effect upon the young man as he sat on the back seat, once more the receptacle into which Mrs. Bessington poured the stream of her talk. There had been simply no evading her if he was to keep anywhere near her daughter. And while he stood irresolute on the pavement, she had simply announced that he was to come in their car. So here he sat, screwed slightly sideways, watching Rome recede into the distance past Mrs. Bessington's bonneted head, and scarcely permitting himself a single glance at her daughter at her side. Beside the chauffeur, he knew, sat Mr. Hecker, attentive and trim. Motoring immediately after lunch, especially if one sits on a back seat and is unable to smoke, and it was out of the question here, produces in certain constitutions a strange, receptive kind of coma. After 10 minutes from the city gate, Neville felt entirely stupid. He was whirling backwards. He could not stretch his legs. The pace was so swift that he had to hold his hat in his hand. And Mrs. Bessington was talking about clergymen. Fortunately, he had enough humor to keep him polite. He nodded and assented and said, "Just so." And she said, "What?" And he said, "I only said just so." And meanwhile he was taking in impressions. He saw and remembered the long curves of the Campagna resembling the long waves of mid-ocean, the strange, ruined yellow stucco houses, the sudden signs of little wayside inns, the monstrous masses of old Roman brickwork. But a headache was beginning again, and he longed for repose. Certainly, it would be pleasant to stroll through budding woods presently, as Mrs. Bessington had promised him. He glanced at Enid. She was motionless and apparently thoughtful. She had not spoken at all since they had left the city. "And there's Frascati at last," observed Mrs. Bessington, without the faintest pause from her appreciative discussion of the parish clergyman who had been her pastor at the time she had been confirmed by the Bishop of Worcester. "It always looks so royal, I think. And you know, Sir Neville, that Stuart Cardinal was bishop here once. The Duke of York, wasn't he? The grandson, I think, of the first Pretender. But I'm not sure of the relationship. But at any rate, George the Fourth, or perhaps it was the third, always recognized him and paid him a pension regularly, which I think was very nice of him, and so he put up his arms here in the cathedral, which we must mind to go and see, because so often people forget to do that, as it's not my idea of a cathedral at all, so small, you know, and not at all the sort of architecture you'd think a cathedral ought to be of, besides having no choir or anything to sing, except just a few men and boys with voices like tin kettles, because I remember being out here for Sunday once, and how much disappointed I was, and to see them misbehaving too, when the canons weren't looking at them, and the canons too,
took snuff, you know, which I really don't think looks very nice, in spite of what people say. But of course I forgot you were a Roman Catholic, or I wouldn't have said such things, because, you know, I always think we ought to make the best of one another, as I often tell Enid, don't I, my dear, when she seems to find fault sometimes. I don't mean seriously, of course, because I'm sure she wouldn't do such a thing. Oh, I wish he wouldn't go so fast over a bump in the road. But we're really there at last. Because don't you think it's really wonderful how we cover the ground nowadays, from the days in which we used to drive out here with a pair of horses, and took 2 hours over it, too. But there's the Marquis, holding up his hand for our man to stop. So I suppose we'd better get out here, if you wouldn't mind telling him, Sir Neville." She ceased.
6. "This is absolutely perfect," said Neville. "Regard me those curved steps, and the little balcony at the top, and those delicious trees." He spoke rather breathlessly. It had been a long pull. "I knew you'd like it," she said. "We'll sit down at the top and look at the view." They really had managed admirably. The bustle in Frascati had been deafening. First, there had assembled round them, at the top of the sort of embanked boulevard where they had left their cars, 5 or 6 cabs, all of whose drivers, in rapid Italian, with strange cries interpreted by Enid as English exclamations, had recommended each his own cab, pointing with whirling whip to the erect pheasant's feathers that crowned each horse's head as a guarantee of good faith. Next there had been the guides, one of whom, persuaded that the party was German, had addressed them eloquently and uninterruptedly in that loud and effective tongue, and all these had agreed together with one voice that to visit Frascati without a guide was the merest foolishness. Thirdly, there had been the flying squadron of small boys who, imitating the drivers, had chanted in chorus such words as "Yesa," "All righta," "Good morning, sir." And in the midst the leaders held forth. The Marchioness was the loudest, in a shrill tone insisting that things must be visited in the proper order, and that there was no time for the Capuchin church if Cicero's school was to be seen. And Mrs. Bessington serenely contributed an unceasing flow of experiences there on previous visits, singing a kind of alto, so to speak, to her hostess's soprano, while the Marquis looked nervously from one to the other and attempted to reduce them to a system. This had been the chance of these two. Mr. Clow was already beginning to stroll beside Mrs. Hecker under the clipped trees, his hands clasped behind him about his ebony stick. Mr. Hecker was inspecting the front of a small shop outside of which hung a tattered chasuble, and Enid turned to Neville. "Let's walk on," she said. "They can catch us up." He nodded, and she went forward into the circle and spoke to her mother. Then she came out again. "I told her, but I don't suppose she heard. Have you ever heard such a noise in all your life?" A guide ran after them, displaying a badge, as they moved upwards towards the cathedral square. "Me very good guide," he said. "Me speak English not like those others fellas." "Avanti," said Neville firmly. "I tell you," began the guide. Enid suddenly laughed rather sharply. "Avanti means come in," she said. She turned to the guide and spoke sharply and emphatically. He fell back, suddenly dismayed. "I thought it was a sort of general dismissal," said Neville. "How well you do it! What did you say to him?" "I told him I knew Frascati several years before his grandfather was born. said the girl gravely. "It's the only way. You must exaggerate as much as they do, or they won't take you seriously." I also told him he was badly educated. "What's the word?" "Maleducato," said the girl. "Let's see the cathedral as we come down again. We're all to meet where we left the cars at 5:30. There'll be lots of time." The walk up was quite perfectly Italian. The sort of road up which, the girl said, carriages really did come, leading upwards from the town from behind the cathedral, ran between high walls of stained stone and stucco, straight into the heart of the woods. There were queer little houses with minute terraces in front of them on the left, for the first couple of 100 yards, built into the wall. The right was unbroken. As they rose higher, the road became even wilder, and all the time Neville had a deliciously tantalizing sense that the view over the Campagna, at present shut out, must be growing more superb with every step. Then they had come to a high archway, with cypresses beyond it, and the beginning of a drive and a kind of lodge, all of grey stone, eloquently ancient. "That's a villa in there," said the girl. "I forget the name. It's a show place. Let's leave that too, till afterwards." So they had risen higher and higher, and the woods loomed dark above them. It was so steep that they did not talk much. Each said, once or twice, that the carriages would soon catch them up, and Neville, at least, as he turned to see, was conscious of an agreeable disappointment that nothing was in sight, except a somnolent old man who had eyed them maliciously 5 minutes ago, as they came up past the steps on which he was lying in the sun. Then the sweet aromas of the woods began to breathe down on them, sharp and wholesome as the smell of the sea, and the sound of running water reached them. Then they had entered the woods, and turned up to the left, and still ascending, had seen presently the long stepped slope, with the ancient curved steps at the end, and the terrace of the Cappuccini, all under the arch of high trees. 7. It was an astoundingly beautiful view when they had crossed the terrace before the shabby old church and cloister, climbed a convenient heap of stones, and sat down sideways on the stone wall that looked towards Rome. Again, the foreground was incredibly shabby. Immediately beneath them was the wire roof of a very dirty foul enclosure, closed on the right by the precipitous wall of the friary. Hens were picking with a spasmodic kind of eagerness, broken by melancholy listlessness, at stripped cabbage stalks, 20 feet below where the two were sitting, and a dishevelled cock stepped, lordly, on their outskirts. But it simply did not matter, as such things do not matter in Italy. For below the foul enclosure, the ground fell away in a considerable cliff of grass and rock, almost straight down, first to a fringe of woods, then to the tumbled roofs of Frascati, all mellow and ancient, and finally, far below Frascati, to the wide hazy stretch of the Campagna, patched and lined, and washed in, so to say, by great streaks and slopes of color, blue, greenish, gray, brown, infinitely significant, and melancholy or suggestive. There it lay, that tattered carpet of old Roman civilization, crossed by iron roads softened into curves, dotted with sparse shadows, right away to where a faint wall of pale gray and blue showed the mighty city herself, closing the horizon, as if Rome were still that place in which all roads, and indeed all wildernesses too, must find their end. The warm sunlight lay over all, and a tender blue sky finished the picture. Well, said the girl gently, after a minute or two of silence. It's simply gorgeous, said the boy. But, you know, he stopped. Yes? It's not the last word. Or perhaps I'd say it isn't the first word. There's Rome still, you know. She nodded 2 or 3 times. I understand perfectly, she said. Neville had a thrill of pleasure. I believe you do, he said. But, Lord, what a prig I must seem. May I smoke? It may relieve matters, because I wish to make some observations. A delicious laughter shone all through her face, though her lips scarcely moved. It was as if a flame danced suddenly within her soul. Really, she was exceedingly pretty, thought Neville. Please smoke, and please make all the observations you wish. I rather think I shall agree, you know. He lighted his cigarette, first holding his case towards her, with a question in his eyebrows, but in silence. She shook her head. Then he began. It's all too tamed, he said. There's that Campagna, you know. It looks wild, but it isn't. It's all been trampled down and bedded out once. You can't forget that. Look at those woods, for instance. They're holding it down all the time. And look at those shadows, which I suppose are houses. They don't even trouble to rebuild them. They're so certain the Campagna can't rise against them. It's beaten. It's dead. And then here are we, and here are those old friars, like lords of the manor, looking down on it all. They've even stuck their old fowl house down bang in front. Why, in England we should have the drawing room here to get the view, to be allowed to admire it. Here they don't care a brass farthing. They know it's theirs. Poor old Campagna. And then, you know, there's Rome, planted bang down in the middle, quite happy and content. She knows the Campagna's beaten and done for. She's not afraid of her. Poor old Campagna. He paused, astonished at his eloquence. He had no idea he could talk like this. He looked at her. She nodded gravely twice. That's it. Go on, please, she said softly. He cleared his throat dramatically and threw a leg over the wall. Well, ladies and gentlemen, the next point to notice is that here in these woods, he waved his hand at them, the situation's quite different. The mountains aren't beaten yet. They're above the friars and the fowl house, and even old Rome. I know they've stuck their villas here, and Cicero's school, or whatever it is. Or is that Tivoli? No, you're quite right. Go on. Tivoli's the waterfall, and the Villa d'Este. Yes, well, those villas and things are only here like a sort of garrison. The woods own them, not they the woods. Look at those slopes up there, and those trees. They're on top, as Mrs. Hecker would say. They're the real thing. They're alive. Look at all those flowers like stars, and the daisies. You don't get flowers like that in the Campagna, or if you do, they don't belong. They aren't characteristic. Isn't that so? Perfectly. Well, up here, they're all right, went on Neville, feeling he'd about come to an end of his observations. Am I talking rot, Miss Bessington? For a moment she did not move. He saw her clean profile, very straight-lined and sharp from nose to chin, still looking out over the haze of the Campagna. Then she turned slowly and looked directly at him with an intent and yet detached sort of interest. He was taken aback a little by her directness. "I think you've summed it up perfectly," she said. "But there's one thing you haven't said." "Dear me! I thought I'd been exhaustive." Her mouth trembled with laughter, and then grew grave again. "You haven't said on which side you yourself are." "I think I know, but I'd like to hear you say it." "Why, on the side of the woods, of course." He sighed audibly. "How I do hate luncheon parties," he added, "even when I'm sitting by Mrs. Bessington." "Thank you very much," she said, completely grave. 8. "You don't look very well," she said an hour later, as they began to find their way downwards again by another path. "You look tired out." There had been no sign of the rest of the party, though the two had waited within view of a patch of the road which, so far as Enid knew, was the only one into the woods up which a carriage could come, and it was quite certain that the Marchioness would not walk. They had talked at ease, with those meditative silences that are the highest compliment that each could pay to the other, about Rome, and life, and nature, and the meaning of things, and indirectly, of course, of themselves all through. Neville had been pretty frank, and Enid no less, or scarcely less. He had said suddenly, after one of his pauses, that he was a Catholic, and could never possibly be anything else, and had proceeded to say that he was afraid he wasn't a very good one. But he had been brought up to it, and had a chapel and a priest at home, and all that. And the girl had nodded in her sympathetic way, and said that she supposed that she was Church of England, and had then begun to say that she couldn't ever be a Catholic, for several reasons, but had omitted to state what these were, and he had not pressed her. It was all very satisfactory then. It was evident to both of them that there was something much deeper in life than conventional religion, that dogmas did not really solve difficulties, but rather increased them, and that the real secret lay somewhere else. Neither of them had said anything as to the passage of time. Indeed, it was probable that neither understood how very quickly time passes under the charm of such conversations as these. The girl's eyes wandered 3 or 4 times rather intently down upon the section of stony road that was in sight 100 feet below. And at last Neville stood up. "We must be going," he had said, and had then wasted 5 minutes more in crowing like a cock, to the furious agitation of the genuine creature below in the enclosure. When the cock, after half a dozen vindictive answers, had begun to peck his wives, the two moved off. Neville did not seem to like being told he looked unwell. "I'm not very well," he said shortly, "and I hate and loathe it." She looked concerned. "I'm sorry," she said. "I didn't know. What's the matter?" "Nothing but headaches," he said. "But why should I have them? I simply can't see sometimes when they're bad. It seems to me unfair." "You mean?" "I mean I can't fit that kind of thing into my philosophy. I try to bear them decently, of course, but I don't submit in the slightest. I resent that kind of thing furiously, exactly as I resent cruelty to animals." She said nothing for a minute. They were approaching a fork in the path. Overhead the trees, still leafless, yet covered, when looked at en masse, with a faint purplish haze that revealed the strong life welling up their fibre, nearly met in an archway. On either side, up on this, down on the other, stretched the tumbled slopes of the mountain, alight with bluebells and the star flowers he had spoken of a while ago. The whole place was full of scent and vigor and youth, redolent and suggestive. To their right, and still far beneath, lay the roofs of the little town, extraordinarily golden in the light as the sun sank downwards. As they came slowly towards the fork in the path, a piece of crumbling wall that stood at the juncture of the ways began to disclose itself as the back of one of those shrines that stand here and there in the Frascati woods. They turned the angle of it and stopped. It was a particularly realistic Pietà. Behind the wire netting that was stretched across its face, there was the group of the mother and son, painted in crude colors, lately renovated. The mother, in an indigo cloak, sitting with upraised face, supported the ghastly body across her knees. The hands and feet ran with crimson. The mouth appeared to grin in a horrible contortion. The limbs were grotesquely elongated and emaciated. Stuck into the meshes of the wiring in front was a small bunch of wilted dandelions. The whole picture was painted in fresco on plaster that had peeled in places, and was half sheltered by a broken pent roof of stone. The two looked at it in silence. They moved on, still in silence. Then the boy broke out. "There," he said, "that was exactly what I meant. I think such things are perfectly horrible. What possible good can that do to anyone? It's completely out of harmony, too. The very colors are wrong. And, besides, why put it in the woods where things are fresh and clean? And that's exactly why I don't like talking about my headaches. Of course, the thing's a fact, but isn't it better?" He stopped suddenly, and again for a few yards the girl did not speak. "I won't ask about your headaches again," she said, with a tremor in her voice that might be humor or a deeper emotion. "I agree with every word you say, you know." "And you agree about that thing up there?" "Of course I do."